With this, a very more formal welcome to this morning session, and the presentation of Cindy Quan, to which we're going to come in a second. Let me just acknowledge with respect, the Lekwangans people on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Quan, and Vasanich peoples whose historic relationship with the land continues to this day. We're grateful to be able to live, play, and work on the unceded territory of the Lekwang speaking people, and we acknowledge, that we are deeply committed to also thinking about the legacy of what this form of unwelcome presence of the settlers mean. I now have the pleasure of introducing Cindy Quan, who should be by now familiar to most of you. Unfortunately, we can't really meet in the hallways. I feel kind of terrible that this sense of community that we normally create at the center is not really, lived experience. But I think, Cindy, we've become acquainted by these, through these Zoom meetings, and it's a real pleasure now to hear about your research. Cindy is currently a graduate student fellow and a PhD candidate in the Department of Psychology at UVic. She came to UVic with an MSc from UVic in 2018 and a BSc from U of T in 2016. And Cindy's research revolves around thinking through the cultural factors that shape mental health in a broad sense. So what are the contextual variables, the cultural environment in which we deal and address and try to understand issues of mental health? And her PhD is very much in this field, and we will hear about learning about heritage cultures in her talk. I should also mention how Cindy has put her knowledge, think about mental health and the cultural variables, to good use in what she's doing. She has worked with the Victoria Taiwanese Association and the Victoria Immigrant and Refugee Center Society in Victoria, so in the community, trying to understand and contribute to the mental health of vulnerable populations. And Cindy has also been a student representative to the Canadian Psychological Association, where she organized 2 student symposiums. So beyond doing her PhD work, Cindy has been quite active in the professional, but also the local community, putting her knowledge to good use. So Cindy, thank you very much for presenting today. We are very curious to hear about your presentation with the title Learning About Heritage Cultures from Afar, a Resource, a Risk Factor for Human Development. With this, Cindy, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Oliver, for that kind introduction. And CFGS has been such a welcoming space. And I echo you in that I'm equally curious to hear about your thoughts. I'll be presenting my research, which is very much grounded in the literature and psychology. And it'll be interesting to hear how some of this thinking parallels ideas in political science, history, or other areas or adjacent fields. Maybe I'll situate where I'm at right now in this process. I've taken a first, so I'll be presenting a pilot study that I've conducted with participants that were based in Victoria, and have then moved on in starting to think about what the next steps are. Wonderful. So I will be talking a little bit about heritage culture. First, if we go to the outline, you'll see that I'll try to contextualize and set the stage of making the argument of why remote learning of heritage culture is relevant in our current world, and especially in the Canadian context. And then I'll go over the research objective I had for this pilot study, as well as the preliminary findings and my ideas for potential next steps. When you think of culture, what comes to mind? In the psychological literature, the way that we define culture is the distinctive custom, values, beliefs, knowledge, art, and language of a society or community. And there's this element in passing it on from one generation to the next. And these are then the basis for everyday behavior and practices. in the broad strokes, we can think of culture as ethnic culture, national culture, indigenous culture, etc. Culture is also sometimes used to characterize attitudes and behaviors of particular groups. So different hip hop culture, rural versus urban culture, etc. And the important point that kind of psychological literature tries to make around culture is that people can have many different kinds of culture, and the culture is multifaceted, and we can be more or less part of cultures behaviorally, or there can be other components, values, and identity. And so these phases and patterns of thinking then shape how we understand the world. For instance, my parents grew up in Vietnam, but my grandparents are all from China, and I lived in Denmark until I was 12 and then moved to Canada. So I have elements of both Chinese culture that I identify strongly with. I have now come to see myself as a Canadian in many ways. I don't really identify much with Danish culture other than their hygge concepts and drinking copious amounts of coffee and eating Danish pastries. Those things I've inherited, but other than that, not as much. And so as we move through this presentation, I invite you to think about how the different cultures, elements are important to you and how you've come to learn about them. If we go to the next slide, in the Canadian context of why it's important to think about heritage culture, especially in Canada, is that 1 in 5 Canadians are foreign-born, which means that many Canadians, along with their children, grow up in a country with another ethnic or national cultural background that may still be quite relevant for them today. More broadly speaking, Canada is a country built on settler colonialism, which means that most people are from a different cultural background. Although we don't talk about this, it's in the forefront of popular media or everyday conversation, as many have already pointed out in the global talks. This is an important part of Canadian history. And the psychological literature oftentimes has centered kind of the norm to be white culture, and culture as being what's studied in other areas, so other countries or other nations. But there's an increasing recognition that it's important to also think about how there is a lot of diversity, even within what we consider white populations. And for instance, thinking about the different avenues and different opportunities that people have taken to migrate to Canada, we know that different cultural groups like Irish immigrants have faced bigotry when they came in the 1840s, and through different historical avenues, Italians in the Second World War, for instance, have experienced a lot of prejudice and discriminations when there were suspicion of alliances with Germany in the Second World War. And quite a few immigrants from Italy at that time anglicized their names and distanced themselves from their Italian backgrounds. So although we might not think so much about heritage culture other than foreign-born individuals, people who recently migrated, it has the potential for having large implications for our cultural learning for majority of people in Canada. Canada also makes an interesting case in that it shows some commitment to multiculturalism. In 1988, the Canadian Multiculturalism Act was passed that aims to preserve and enhance cultural diversity in the form of languages, customs, religions, and so forth. And that this means that there are at least some reception in society towards multiculturalism, which makes a difference from some other national policies that focuses on assimilation and for immigrants or people from other heritage culture to fit in rather than celebrate what might be their different backgrounds. I'll be talking about the Canadian context in particular, but be interested to hear how you think some of these ideas may translate or not to other spaces that you do research in. If we move on to cultural learning from a psychological literature, most of these studies have examined heritage culture and how identification with both a heritage culture and a receiving culture is associated with different outcome measures. Oftentimes, these studies focus on childhood and adolescent development. So looking at how identifying, for example, with one's Latino heritage or Asian heritage, or with Canadian culture, or if it's a US-based study where a lot of this work is done, how that is related to mental health, family conflict, academic achievement, etc. And generally speaking, for the most parts, being fluent and proficient in more than one culture means that a child and adolescent navigates better at home and in the broader society, and are associated with better outcomes. Traditionally, a lot of this research has focused on childhood and adolescence, with the lens that most cultural transmission happen early on. There's a lot of learning going on for sure, but there's also been a recognition that we don't stop developing once people turn 18 or 19, and that in the last couple of decades, journals and books have been written about emerging adulthood and how that's an important phase of life for identity development, figuring out what one's meaning and purpose are. And so part of the objective of this research is really to extend that body of understanding of how cultural learning happens beyond just adolescence. The other factor that's interesting to consider is that agency also increases with age. So how we spend our time, our ability to decide what we do also increases with age. And as there are more options for engaging in cultural learning as we grow up, if there has been an undervaluing of particular cultures, there might be a loss of culture in the home and the lack of opportunity to learn about one's heritage at home. So that could be survivors of cultural oppressions, or for international adoptees where the cultural transmission doesn't naturally occur within the family system. Why am I interested about the remote part then? With globalization, the other thing that has happened in the last decade and two is that there's been a proliferation of accessibility for different kinds of learning, technological learning, through social media, following of news. The ability to travel has become more affordable as well. And there's been studies looking at the remote acculturation, which is learning about other cultures. As probably won't be a surprise to a lot of this audience, is that oftentimes those studies focus on Americanization and how certain kinds of ideas in America has been translated to other areas of the world. And so through different vehicles, for instance, a lot of receiving goods, media, and consuming different kinds of television and fast food have implications for people in other countries. And Gil Ferguson's work from University of Minnesota has looked at the implications for Americanization of Jamaican adolescents, and how those who report stronger acculturation, who's never been to America, but through these different vehicles of media, food, etc., report more conflicts with parents as well, and lower sense of family obligation. So even if one doesn't travel, there's this opportunity for impact and trickle effects into other areas of one's life by proxy of learning about cultures from afar. And this has really spurred my interest in understanding what are the ways in which people learn about heritage culture from afar and through intermittent exposure, and why might that matter? And one avenue that I'm really interested in with my doctoral degree being primarily in clinical psychology is how to deliver culturally responsive services. And within clinical psychology, there's been a movement to try to become more culturally competent, in recognition that there's a lot of diversity in the population, and there's an ethical obligation to be respectful and understanding of different cultural backgrounds. The cultural competency theories oftentimes start with, if we go to the next slides, thank you, Jody, we are centered around this first step of awareness. So in order to become culturally competent, One first needs to be aware that we have particular values and particular ways of viewing the world, and to understand how these values come to be based on our different identities or intersectionalities. So this first steps is crucial for developing any kind of cultural competency. And knowing that learning about one's heritage culture is overlapping with this idea of knowing about one's values by discovering. I'm really interested in seeing what kind of tangible ideas or abilities will this heritage learning potentially afford for development of cultural competence. The second step is this cultural sensitivity and humility that comes from having some awareness. And this implies that individuals are aware of differences and are respectful of differences, and are respectful that there are issues related to power, privilege, and oppression, and increases an individual's sense of humility, that their worldview is not necessarily the only worldview, and they're in no position to judge differences as good or bad. The third part is oftentimes learning about other cultures. So being curious and learning about other cultures in the clinical settings. So that would be trying to make an effort to understand the client's background, how that shapes their understanding and their challenges, without making assumptions that the clinician knows more about the client than the client does by virtue of having tried to do some learning, and also interacting and understanding the within group diversity amongst people from different cultural background. And this being a continuous process. So the last kind of diagram of showing how this is iterative is this idea that cultural competence isn't something that's achieved and static, but something that needs continuous reflection and learning as a person themselves change and as cultures change with time. So this brings me to my research objectives. My first research objective was really exploring what motivates people to learn about their heritage cultures. Are there particular reasons that people do so? And what are the impacts? Does it have anything to do with cultural competence? Are there other implications? What are the profile of remote enculturation activities, and what does that look like? What kind of vehicles are people likely to use in order to learn about their heritage culture? And so to do that, I asked open-ended questions about motivations and impacts, and also had a checklist of questions that might be relevant to prompt participants to think about different kinds of activities that they might have engaged in, and asked them to add any additional ones that weren't already on the list. So the sample was a convenience sample from university students, similar to what we see in a lot of university departments in social sciences. There was a larger female representation in the sample. Almost 3/4 of the sample was female. And then with about a quarter being males, and only 1% non-binary. In terms of immigration status, there was a mixture of people both being born in Canada and people who have immigrated in Canada. The average age was around 20 years of age, with a range of 18 to 41. So I have a sample that's very much what's been coined a weird sample in the behavioral science studies, and I'm very much aware of that. So weird standing for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, developed, and that the motivations and impacts that are cited by these are only really reflective of this particular type of sample. But nevertheless, a starting point to think about whether or not this is a concept worth fleshing out further. In terms of primary heritage culture that people were learning about, if I go to the next slide, you'll see that there's a good mix. So when the recruitment was rolled out, participants were just only had to say that they identified with more than one cultural background. And I ended up with a good variety, predominantly from European heritages as well as Asian heritages. Within the European region, the participant came from mostly northern and western areas of Europe, and within Asia it was mostly east and south central areas of Asia. I also asked them to report whether there was a secondary heritage culture, recognizing that people might be learning about multiple heritage cultures. And about 30% of participants reported a secondary heritage culture, which I didn't analyze for the purposes of this presentation, but also reflects that people in this particular sample have multiple cultures that they are learning about from afar. So what did I find? It was motivations. I'm really curious to hear whether or not you have a framework that you think is more helpful for thinking about this or an organizational structure. I used a basic thematic analysis coding bottom up to look at whether or not there was any clusters of themes that might come out. And what I came across in this as a organizing framework for what I saw was just internal versus external motivations, as well as one that was more promotion focused, which in the literature of psychology would be thinking towards creating or gaining or achieving something. I didn't find it the responses of the participant mapped on as neatly to this other dimension, which is a prevention orientation, where people see their goals mostly as responsibilities or concentrate on staying safe. The flavor of responses that I got were what seemed to me to be more around filling in a gap of some sort. So the internal versus external dimension, as well as a promotion, so more strength-based one, and one that's more about filling in the gaps. And of course, people can have various motivations at various time points, but generally speaking, people have some stable individual differences in how much internally versus externally motivated they are, or how much they are oriented towards achieving goals versus staying safe. Examples of some of these themes that came out I've represented on this next diagram with 4 quadrants. The internal one and external one kind of on the horizontal, and then on vertical, the promotion and the filling in a gap. I don't have a good word for that yet, so if you can think of one, I very much welcome that. There were more promotion-oriented ones than filling in the gaps types of responses, and I've tried to reflect that in the number of quotes I've put up on this slides. So within the internal one, I saw some possible sub-themes around personality traits of openness. So this is the idea that someone is high in the trait of being willing to embrace new things or fresh ideas or novel experiences, or being curious in general. So that would be responses like, I just have a general openness to learning. There was also pragmatic reasons, future reasons, such as I want the options to live in Italy. And elements of growing up that were captured as well. So when I grew up, I never really paid attention or realized that I was of mixed ethnicity. As I get older, I begin to realize and acknowledge my diverse backgrounds more and want to learn as much about my background as possible. On the more external area of the motivation spectrum, there were both interpersonal and contextual types of responses. So that would be, for example, traveling to India when I was 18 spurred my interest in learning about my heritage culture, or I would like to travel back to France to show my culture to my partner. Learning about World War II and how my dad grew up during this time in East Germany. Or when I met a hot guy with my ethnicity, I want to improve my colloquialism to seem cool to him. So these interpersonal or contextual influences from motivation rather than this inherent sense that you saw in this other side of the spectrum. Or when I moved out and began cooking my traditional meals for my friends and roommates, it made me realize how many traditionally English things I was doing and spurred my interest to learn more. So these contextual cues for prompting an interest. In terms of filling in a gap, you'll see that it has more of this compensatory function, or at least it sounds like that to me. So realizing how far removed I am from my origin and my parents' origin, a feeling of missing a sense of identity when I started traveling. I envied the locals who lived in their own country, so I used remote enculturation to fill that empty space I usually felt. Or external things such as I've always been interested in learning about my heritage, but living in rural northern BC, I didn't have many opportunities. Meeting people who were more in tune with their culture and realizing that I wasn't. So instead of just building and thinking about it as a positive to be achieved or a new experience, it has this, it has more of an undertone of compensating in some ways for something that isn't there. And then there was also some people who noted that there were no particular reasons that they could have identified that made them interested. So what about the effects? We found mostly positive developmental effects. So people reporting mostly things that were positive in their opinion about the impacts about learning, a few neutral and very few negative. One thing that I was curious about from a theoretical standpoint, some people have studied developmental pathways through radicalization that takes place using remote learning through technology of particular sub-threats on the internet, etc. I didn't see any of that in this particular sample, but it certainly it's still a possibility. What I found in this sample was that most of the reports were positive. So on the next slide, you'll see I've represented this with a larger circle, and the three kind of sub-themes that I saw within the positive development were cultural competency, heritage identity development, as well as retaining culture and ties. And then I saw a few negative reports. The first one around cultural competency were related and overlapping with what was in the literature. So there were quotes around self-awareness, broadening perspectives, curiosity and appreciation, skill building. So for instance, it has made me a more diverse person. An understanding of other cultures and ethnicities, since I know what it's like to be different. Or knowing about the Netherlands' socialist nature perhaps has made me more open to socialist ideas. I grew up in rural Saskatchewan, so that wasn't where I learned it. Generally, I think it has instilled a more open mind in me, and it may even aid me to be less biased and discriminatory of other cultures and accented people. It's made me think of differences in cultures worldwide, or I'm able to look at situations from a multitude of perspectives. So these ideas around the learning being a vehicle for learning about other cultures and oneself as a diverse person. The next group of reports that I found were in relation to one's heritage identity, unsurprisingly, given that people are learning about the heritage. So that would be around positive affect or exploration, understanding or knowledge or closer interpersonal ties. Comments such as, I'm proud to be a real Korean. It's made me feel unique and special in that I can share these practices and cultures with my family. When my parents came to Canada as immigrants, they were unwanted by other Canadians. They tried very hard to hide their Italian culture and tried to forget their Italian. So a real sense of happiness in feeling special that they can contribute that part to their family, giving me a better understanding of myself and my family and why we are the way we are and why we do the things we do. In the psychological literature, sometimes what can happen with immigrant families is that parents are more oriented towards the heritage culture, and kids are less so. And in some cases, this may increase cultural conflicts because kids don't share the same cultural value as parents may. For instance, in Asian culture, there can be a stronger hierarchy, and ideas around filial piety and respect that is less structured in a kind of mainstream Canadian culture. And when there's a gap in heritage identification for children and parents, there can sometimes be conflicts at home. So these impacts reflecting a better understanding of themselves and where their parents are coming from. And then the third cluster were around more maintaining culture rather than learning about one's culture. So that would be feeling part of my family in Ireland when I'm not there, or kept my heritage alive. I saw a comment pop up. I'll be curious to read that right after the chat. And yes, please, if you see any other ways of structuring this, I will be really interested to hear those thoughts. These were my initial ideas after passing through the codes. In terms of negative development, then, there were far fewer. There were sometimes what, Jody, if you go to the next slide, in the bottom left, you'll see that there were kind of two things that I noted that might come up. So some tension around the compatibility of different cultures. One person, for example, said, "My culture devalues me for being a girl, so I don't care to learn any more about it." So this idea that because cultures are different, there are different levels of compatibility, and when it's hard to reconcile, it may not be a positive experience to learn about one's heritage culture. The other, a couple of other comments that were more about the process of learning as well as the impact of learning were things such as, through the news and media, only see the very worst or the very best. So this recognition that without being fully immersed, one is seeing one's heritage culture through a filtered lens. And that in some ways is shaping how much that they are able to learn, or what kinds of things that one is learning. Okay, so that was a lot of information. In the last few slides, I'm just going to give you a broad overview of the kinds of things that I asked about in terms of what people were doing to learn about their heritage culture. So there were 7 different avenues that I've developed with a collaborator who had done some work using pilot responses in class about learning their culture. The first one was distant communication, so using phone and online communication to connect with family and relatives from afar, such as my grandpa currently lives in Kenya, and I Skype with him once a month to catch up and keep in touch. Use of entertainment, watching and listening to media such as movies, TV shows, and music produced in places linked to one's heritage. Traveling, intermittent visits, or going on a study abroad in one's heritage country to learn about the culture there. Food preparation and consumption from a person's heritage. So that might be parents sending things, or grandmother making things, for example. Or participating in cultural traditions, celebrating cultural events, ceremonies, or holidays, including religious ceremonies and rites of passage that are not typical. So going to the Sikh temple, for instance, for summer camp, for services or in cultural festivities. Following of current events and news to stay connected and learn about the culture. Or educational efforts. So this is, broadly speaking, taking classes about a person's heritage, such as language learning on weekends, or taking a specific course in university, or more self-directed learning, such as using an online genealogy to learn about my history. So these were the 7 categories overarching that I asked participants about, and also gave them an opportunity to add anything that was missing. And there was nothing, no new category that seemed to come out of that. So a first picture of what kind of learning takes place. One developmental trend that we see that makes perfect sense is that a lot of these things are started in childhood, and there's quite a lot of numbers of avenues used. So people on average reported 5. There was no differences by gender or immigration status. There were a small difference between participants with Asian and African backgrounds that reported on average of 5.4 versus people with European backgrounds that reported around 4.8 out of 7. It'll be interesting to know whether or not there are more systematic differences for racialized minority, whether they're more likely to use these avenues or not. For all of the avenues except for social media and news, those were mostly started in childhood, and classes were about 50-50. In terms of who self-initiated this, from a developmental perspective, it makes sense that most of these were parent-initiated, such as cooking, celebrating holidays, visiting or phoning. The green bar over here is parent-initiated, and then the blue one is grandparents. So grandparents have some role in transmitting culture through holidays and food in particular. The ones that were mostly self-initiated was following news and social media, as well as taking classes. And this coincides well with what was reported in terms of the age that they started using these avenues. With this initial picture, then, as I'm writing up these findings, I'm curious about the next steps. I have a number of different things that I thought would be interesting to examine next. One being the relation to psychological well-being. So knowing that heritage culture is often a protective factor for development, and seeing the reports like I feel proud to be Korean, I feel more connected to my family, examine the relation between remote enculturation activities and psychological well-being, and also looking at how it is related to traditional enculturation. So traditional enculturation being mostly what's happening at home, things that are not self-initiated, and whether or not remote enculturation is used as a positive type of spillover, where in families where there is a lot of heritage culture present, you are adding it on top of that, or if it's more compensatory. So the reports of because there's nothing around in rural BC, that's why I'm using remote enculturation. And to adopt an intersectional lens, thinking about how people with different social positions use remote enculturation differently, and whether or not there are different benefits to different kinds of people. The second part is to administer the revised instrument to a community sample, so capture motivation and impacts in other periods of the lifespan, not just in young adulthood. The idea here being that in different periods of the lifespan, in psychology, we think that there are different things that people are motivated about. For instance, in later periods of the lifespan, there's a focus perhaps on generativity that's not as present for most people in adolescence and young adulthood. This idea of wanting to contribute, or there might be other developmental milestones like getting married that is not common not as common for 20-year-olds, or having a first child that may spur interest in learning about what are the cultural rituals, cultural beliefs around these types of milestones that could be a prompt for learning about one's heritage culture. And also validate the questionnaire. So establishing convergent and divergent validity with other construct to see how it's similar or different, and whether there's any added value really to follow up on this. And then finally, examining remote enculturation in different settings. So exploring the role of ethnic density, for instance. The sample is predominantly in Victoria, which is probably a very different learning experience than if somebody was immersed in a metropolitan city like Toronto, and very different from living in rural BC or in Saskatchewan. And also in different contexts where policies may not be as supportive of multiculturalism. What kinds of impact might that have on remote enculturation, motivations, and impact? That was a quick overview of where I'm at now, and I'll be really curious to hear any questions you have, criticism, feedback, suggestions. And thank you, Jody, for sharing the slides.
Thank you very much, Cindy. Yeah, you can see the applause. It's a bit quiet, but I think we around the virtual table, we greatly appreciate your very diligently done research design and addressing an issue that speaks to so many Canadians in particular. When I listened to you, I thought that would be a great story also to share more widely. One is your more focused scholarly research, but I think you're touching on issues, the kind of complex identities that we as Canadians very often have, right? That would make for a very good media or broader outreach story as well. But that's a different thing to consider. First you need to finish your PhD, I suppose. So, who wants to start us off with a question? Or maybe while people are thinking, oh, Nicole is right off the okay, Ken as well. So Nicole, you go first, and then Ken.
Thanks, Cindy. That was really interesting. I maybe missed this at the beginning, but I saw that I think your sample was 54% European, and then I can't remember what the others were. But while you were talking, I was thinking about my own experience as a white settler, European heritage, living in Canada, right? So I am living in my own culture. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering about how that factors into your findings in terms of those who reported European roots, mm-hmm. Whether or not the enculturation of learning about your own culture, like I'm thinking of things that my family did that weren't ever really about Canadian culture. They were just our family and what we did. But of course that is part of our culture. But I had never, you don't think about your own culture when you're living, you think about it more when I'm living abroad or working abroad. And then it's like, oh, what is Canadian? Who am I? What are Canadian culture? So I'm wondering, and I might have missed that, but I was thinking about that as you were, because what I was hearing is that this is actually more relevant for people who are remote, outside of their own culture.
That's a great question. I don't think I addressed that head on at the beginning. So I was asking them to think about a culture and to think about learning about a culture that, so they identified as having more than one culture. So the culture other than Canadian culture. So if they were of European heritage, that would be, for example, my Irish culture or my Italian culture or something like that. What you're saying, there's a quote, I can't remember what it was, but I find it as such a good capture of culture being kind of if we are fish, culture is the ocean that we swim in. Like it's invisible to us and we don't really think about it very much. And I think that's what's happened for a lot of people who are non-racialized in Canada, that we don't really, and it surprised me actually that there was about 40% of people with European heritage that opted in for the study and that it wasn't a larger proportion of racialized minorities.
So they had the option they opted in if they did identify with a second culture.
Okay. Yeah, so I put out posters saying that if you identify with more than one culture, okay. And are interested in participating, yeah.
Okay, great, thanks.
Ken, good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you all, and thanks, Cindy. That was a wonderful talk, and I spent my career in the Foreign Service, so living abroad and meeting a lot of Canadians who had a different culture from, say, the country that I was posted in. And I was curious about whether you'd encountered the issue of a kind of a cultural time warp, in the sense that somebody's parents may have emigrated to Canada in the late 50s or 60s, and what they knew of the culture of their country, the country they came from, was based in that time period. And then the kids sort of learn about that country. Meanwhile, that country's moved on, and the beliefs and the culture has changed. And the example I was posted in India, and I remember a colleague, and she was Punjabi Canadian, and she said it was quite frustrating for her. She grew up in Vancouver, but in a very traditional Punjabi household, and the reins were pretty tight. And when she would go to India to visit her cousins, she said her cousins were out dating and going out to parties and doing everything she was not allowed to do in Vancouver. And so her concept of, what was the culture was a bit different. So I'm just wondering about if you came across this issue of people learning about their culture, but it was a culture of 50 years ago and wasn't necessarily relevant today in terms of what that country had, the beliefs and culture of that country.
Right, that is such a good point. I don't think I saw it as much in this particular sample, but I've certainly heard about it anecdotally in my clinical work as well. And this idea of the diaspora having been so disconnected from what's happening and the changes and culture being fluid means that what parents and the older generations are holding on to might be different than what they experience. What I did see in this sample that's a bit related is this idea that it was a lot more vibrant or a lot more exciting than they thought when they, for example, goes to visit India or visit Sri Lanka, that they've heard about it, but it was kind of dull. And then when they went there was actually a lot more to it. And that being interesting to them, which might not capture exactly the time warp, but I think gets to that idea that we only see a smaller representation and we probably don't see the dynamic changes that are happening unless we are immersed in a culture.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, Cindy, I could probably give you a couple of stories about old-fashioned German culture that I've encountered here in Canada that feels very alien for someone who relatively recently came from the old continent. But I think these stories, they might ask for a glass of wine and a bit of time. But a bit more seriously, let me reflect. It was great to see the uplifting spirit of people saying, this culture, the second culture, was positive, or it's seen in a positive light. From my both teenagers who've now almost reached your sample group in terms of age, what I heard often was some reservation about wanted to be seen as Germans, right? They were born here, but there was a very clear sense of, sometimes people say, oh, you're German, right? And, they definitely didn't endorse this sense of being labeled in this heritage culture, right? And, they want to be as Canadian as possible. So that maybe it is a matter of time, right? Yeah, one interpretation would be to say, this is typical teenage time, right? Where you struggle to find your identity in psychological terms. And once you become a student, you're more mature, but also more reflective of the positive things that this culture might have brought. So maybe it's simply an age thing. The other interpretation would be taking on my hat as a political scientist, and you mentioned multiculturalism. To have a positive reference to your cultural heritage, you need an environment which endorses and accepts this heritage culture, right? So we live in Canada, multicultural society. You alluded to this in your introduction, that in a way provides a space, a positive space, and sure of major cities probably more so than more rural environments. So in a way, it's it reflects a particular Canadian setting. I suppose if you did this study in countries that have a more negative attitude towards these kind of other cultures, right? That are more maybe nationalist and more exclusionary in their cultural attitude, you might have a different interpretation. So just two ways of looking at the sometimes negative attitudes that people might have being raised into and exposed to this heritage.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think all those points is so valid, and why it's so important to one, have the developmental lens to understand, and also thinking about, I liked your framing around this as more of a macro versus micro issue, and thinking about kind of the different levels of analysis. If I'm thinking about it in like a Bronfenbrenner type of socio-ecological model, what are the different levels in which people's motivations are impact are influenced?
Yeah, no, that's great. And a bit less serious. I tried this a couple of times. Painting myself as German was never cool. You know, it never gives you a lot of credit and, you know, social status. So, you know, you have to play around with these ethnic stereotypes when you don't know what the positive effects on the dating scene or so.
You certainly do.
German doesn't work. So, but
yeah, I wonder where the participant is from, and I'm sure it would not have been cool to play up the ethnic heritage in other setting, only when it was a guy from that particular culture.
All right, any other, you know, probably more serious questions? Rod, do you want to speak to the point that you brought up when it came to the conceptualization of the research?
Sure, I can put the question. I'm wondering about this issue that was raised going as you went to your 2x2 matrix and the vertical axis. You were struggling with this question of promotion, prevention, and maybe prevention is in some sense fulfillment. Well, actually, fulfillment is what struck me. But the trouble is, it starts to get, as you pursue that, if you're thinking promotion objectively, promotion of opportunities outside at the top of your vertical axis, and filling an internal need at the bottom, it starts to become just another label for the external internal. But it did seem to me that you're promoting opportunities externally. The counterpart at the other end is promoting some kind of inside satisfaction.
Yeah, that's a good point. I have really struggled with thinking about how to best capture these different aspects of what people are saying.
Yeah, it may be that the 2x2 matrix isn't the solution, of course.
Maybe it isn't.
It may be just shades along the spectrum of what am I doing because it satisfies me, as compared to what am I doing because external circumstances are calling for.
Right, yeah.
Overall, congratulations on the paper. It was a fascinating discussion.
Thank you.
I can, but fascinating.
Thank you.
Cindy, if you allow, you know, oh, sorry, Nicole, please.
I was just going to contribute further because I think, Cindy, you're looking to try to help, you're looking for help on the conceptualization, and just picking up on Rod's last point there of the internal, external, and that there are you know, as he just said, it's really about, in some cases, it's about fulfilling something within, and in other cases, it's about appeasing others beyond, or whatever. And so that maybe the 2x2 doesn't work, but having just the linear line with moments, you know, in space around it that aren't necessarily opposite to one another, like the 2x2 grid kind of puts you in that box that matrix that you can't, it's not as dynamic. I mean, I don't know how that would look, but perhaps the 2x2 is putting you in a box that is limiting the potential for the framing.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I'll probably go back to the drawing board, and I'll think about the internal, external, and think about other ways in which to make sense of it. And whether or not I have to make a distinction between kind of positive versus negative types of strengths or deficit focused. Maybe there isn't a need for a distinction, by going back with fresh eyes based on your feedback.
Cindy, could you help me understand, the scope of your research? You described very, nicely and well empirically founded, how people adopt a certain culture and the identity that goes with it. Do you actually look at the effects? Because you speak about your mental health is, one of these things that you're interested in. Human development was in your title. Does your data allow to look at the long-term trajectory and trying to understand what does it do actually to people having multiple identities, being versatile in different cultures? Does it strengthen their mental health, their sense of belonging? Does your data allow to draw these rather general but I think highly fascinating conclusions?
It doesn't, and I would really love to. So I'm in kind of the design phase of thinking about which direction do I want to take this next? And I think that is one of the pieces that I'm really interested in, looking at it longitudinally to see, not to see kind of when people do learn, and it'll probably be mostly correlational, but is that related to increased reporting at a second time point? The way that I have, not in this particular research, but in another paper that I've been working on, I've been looking at using cultural behaviors. So speaking the language, enjoying what you do, like cultural foods, hanging out with people of the same ethnicity, that type of thing, predicting cultural development at 18 months later. So I can see a similar kind of setup where looking at what you are doing now and what kind of behaviors you are doing now, predicting different well-being outcome measures or better interpersonal relationship with your family 18 months or 2 years later. Yeah.
And Cindy, I understand, Rod, just give me 1 second. I understand you work with recent immigrants as well, right? You interact through the associations that we have in Victoria. So that is a group that, speaks directly, they're in this transition phase, right? And they negotiate their new identity and their old identity. So I think, they could, if you think about future research projects, right? You could think about doing this on a particular, if you want a group in transition, right? And how this plays out in a very short time frame and how it allows them to resettle in Canada. But that might be something for the future.
That's an excellent idea. I've never thought about that.
Even longer for the future, if we think of complexity science and all, just thinking about this notion, there's something in the air, there's something flowing. So we have the acculturation, we've got the ideas flowing, some kinds of ideas flowing to people abroad. We've got the enculturation, and my guess is it's a different kind of idea. I mean, you absorb Pepsi and sneakers as part of the acculturation process. You learn news about the homeland with enculturation. You think about Ken's comment, of course, these things are all flowing over time. And so you've got, and of course you've got the ideas embodied in people flowing with the migration. So you've got this tremendous dynamic ball of ideas and notions somehow congealing in a whole set of different perspectives on the world, different ways of observing and knowing the world. So I'm not quite sure how to propose a practical research question out of that, but it's intriguing to think about the ways in which these different ideas, in some sense, come home to a physical embodiment in the head.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Kind of how this circulation of culture in so many different ways are taken on by the person. Yeah, I think that's one of the struggles. The culture, like what culture are you enculturating to? Kind of, it's partly shaped by what avenues you use and who you're learning from, and so there's that piece to it as well. And it's in some ways it's messy, and it's it's hard to capture. And I think that's why I oftentimes fall back to the default of what are you learning about, and having them kind of define that for me.
Yeah, Cindy, we're sending you all these ways. Probably you need more help with your immediate task at hand, your PhD. But I think it speaks to the quality and the attractiveness of your research. That there are so many things that you could attach to it and lead you into. But maybe your very last point, thinking about how people learn. Do you see, what you do is in a way the old story of migration, of multiple cultures, of living increasingly in the globalized world. I'm not sure to what degree you can speak to the special role of new media that really bridges cultural divides and territories. Because just imagine, right, an Italian immigrant beginning of the 20th century coming to Vancouver. That was, they were detached, they had their small local Italian community, but really, even to get their hands on some good red wine and pasta, I think was difficult. And so just, now you have all the, you can watch TV from your home country all the time. You can talk to your grandparents at home. These things must have changed how we reproduce these cultural ties.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. One of the fascinating parts to me was that, well, news and social media was the one that was clearly most self-directed. So it's the one that people kind of gravitate towards the most when they're thinking about learning for themselves. And it probably also suggests this more active phase of learning. I haven't thought about it in this term, but I can also see kind of when you ask about what are the different ways in people learn, there's some more passive ways of learning, kind of the people show you this, people send you cookies, you don't really do much yourself, whereas you might be seeking out and trying to learn and incorporate and think through some of these things. And social media and technology phase in particular, I think it's really interesting because you do have more access to different kinds of knowledge than before, and more quickly. Even though the person was saying, I only see a certain kind of representation. And I'm thinking back to Ken's comment earlier about the time warp. If you're watching specific kinds of media, television shows from the 80s, my grandparents, when I was living in Denmark, had cassette tapes from television dramas from the 80s. So that's what I learned. If growing up with social media, you form I think there's a possibility of forming a stronger connection, one. So this is an empirical question. Do people form stronger connection? Because you're also using it more frequently. So I didn't show it in this graph, but of course, traveling wise and holidays, you might only be celebrating once or twice a year, but you can be engaged in the news and follow the news on a daily basis. And we know that social media can become quite addictive in that way. So there's the potential, I'm thinking as I'm talking, of developing possibly a stronger connection than previous avenues.
In a way, Ken's question also, talked about the conceptual difficulty. On the one hand, you describe these as two set cultures, but really, the heritage culture also evolves, right? And becomes probably closer to what we have here, if you want a kind of global culture in terms of music, even food and so forth, right? So you take this as, all right, either you do or you don't absorb this heritage culture, but what exactly is this heritage culture, right? It's fast evolving with new media, and that's another fascinating layer of your research, right? That we think we know what it is, but really it is also for generations a very different thing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think that's why it's hard to talk about the culture. There's distinct values that don't shift as quickly that we can map on to kind of these, broadly speaking, more individualistic or collective types of cultures. But there's also evidence shows that people from global cities around the world share more similar values than people within the same nation that lives in rural versus urban. So it's a complex picture for sure.
Rod.
Well, and raises an interesting question around this puzzle as to whether there are core universal values. Do we have anything like global universal values, or do these cultural things that we absorb with the kinds of processes you're talking about influence what we would think of as the core obligations of the individual to the community, or the alternative, can we reconcile Latithere's core Asian values with something like what's going on in the United States, or you know, the consensus, the various kinds of consensus that's promoted, and that core set of ideas could be built and influenced in ways that are quite different from the other cultural features that you're exploring with your own research.
Yeah, I think one thing that somewhat surprised me was the number of people commenting on these cultural competencies that transcends this culture-specific learning. It's not so much that I'm necessarily learning about my heritage culture and becoming more proficient in that. It's this idea that I think of myself as a more diverse person. I recognize that people are more diverse and are multifaceted. And maybe that's kind of close to what you're thinking about in terms of the core values, these core sets of ideas that in essence, we are all kind of people, basically. And this developing of empathy. So one of the quotes around, like, I'm more understanding of other cultures because I understand what it's also like to feel different. So not so cultural specific per se, but this broader sets of competencies and attitude shift that may happen as a process of reflection and learning.
Yeah. Can we get Phoniforman circles of sympathy expanded to be global? Will we have the true cosmopolitan culture?
That's a very nice vision for Canadian society. I hope we go down this road. Let's see about that.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? You can see here how confident we are in your research that Nicole wants to send you off to a postdoc already.
I probably definitely need the extra time to finish answering some of these questions.
Any other question? Ken, please.
Yeah, just a question about the connection between embracing your or learning about your cultural heritage and fluency in the language of your culture. What's how deep is that correlation? Can you ever really become connected if you don't speak the language? Or
yeah, they oftentimes are connected. So it's interesting, the way that they have kind of conceptualized this is that there might be multiple domains of cultural orientation. So you might have things like identity, values, and behaviors. The idea here being that, for example, there might be people who grow up with a ethnic background and not speak the language, but still strongly identify with the culture. So, for example, having kind of just anecdotal example of friends who don't really speak Chinese, but still think of themselves as Chinese. And certainly there are people who can do that, but we also see that it often goes hand in hand. So if you are highly behavioral, you have a lot of the behaviors of a culture, you speak the language, you're probably going to enjoy and know more about how to navigate that world. And so you probably also identify with it more. So it's often overlapping of kind of cultural orientations with including elements of identity and behaviors like language. And that's why language is often used as a proxy, but it's not the cleanest proxy, because you could also speak the language and not share the values. Like, for instance, in the example where the person said, like, my culture devalues me, so I just don't identify with it. They could still be proficient in the language, but not see themselves as part of that culture. Language is a strong proxy in some cases, though, especially for more recent immigrations, but are harder, I think, less strong of a proxy for people who might be second generation, the more removed, because oftentimes they don't speak the language, but might more or less still share values or identification with the country.
Well, I wonder, I mean, this isn't directly on the language question, but the degree to which culture is socially constructed or even constructed by ourselves and our own families to, you know, to hang on to the values or to feel connected to the homeland or home territory or whatever. And so this idea that culture is a point or like a static, you know, you're trying to, or you're not trying to, but you're trying to connect to it or reach it as if it's not moving, you know? And I think particularly for immigrants or people who are on the move or living outside their home culture, I feel like for me, this happened when I was living outside of Canada and was a minor, like, but you know, I wasn't the visible majority in countries that I've lived in. I also kind of created a culture in my head that I wanted to feel connected to that maybe wasn't what other Canadians living in those places would think of as their culture, or also wasn't the version of the Tanzanian culture that they were trying to learn about that I was also trying to learn about, right? So that for each, it's so contextual or specific to our own creation or our own construction of what element of culture we're looking for, whether it's language or values or food or, you know, connection, whatever.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's why it's really hard to say kind of objectively, and why we rely so much on self-reports for cultural orientations. Like, how much do you feel like you belong, or how much do you feel part of this group? How much pride do you feel, rather than having kind of more objective of like knowledge based. So it's more of this subjective feeling of being part of the culture, because each person's definition or way of understanding what it means to be part of the culture is a little bit different.
Yeah. The other thing I would just say is I feel like in the first cluster of kind of next directions, one of them was on intersectionality. And one of the things I was thinking about was the difference specifically in gender of respondents. And certainly because of your kind of involvement in the community and policy and things like that, I've been speaking with people in the federal government and in the provincial government, both of whom are very concerned with things like the feminist international assistance policy or GBA plus gender-based analysis. So, you know, that dimension might be fruitful for future opportunity or carving out a niche in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. This is all hindsight bias. I feel like there's so many things I wish I had asked and done differently, that that would be a really important next step for thinking about these, knowing that there are important differences, and what does it mean for people who, based on their gender or different kinds of identification. I mean, it was a very small non-binary sample, but what is that experience like? And is it safer to use remote means for some people if you aren't sure how your community or certain communities kind of relate to LGBT or non-binary and all that kind of things, compared to more traditional means, because you can be more selective using kind of technology and enter specific kinds of forum, etc. Yeah, thank you for that suggestion.
Especially in making the link to mental health or to well-being, right?
Yeah.
Probably, I would guess that it's not equal across all different identities or sectionalities.
Yeah.
And Cindy, we always feel we don't have enough data. We should have asked different questions. I think that's, you know, there's something we are always left with after an empirical research. So don't be too frustrated. I think you have a wonderful database there that you can use, you know, definitely for your PhD. You have plenty of material to interpret. And I hope at least we gave you some ideas of how to approach this. And, you know, we definitely want to see, you know, once you're done with your study, hopefully we'll be able to welcome you back here and hear about, you know, how in the end you interpret this. But I think, you know, that it speaks so clearly to fundamental issues also, if you think about what we do here, global studies, right? You know, how you negotiate these identities. And clearly I think you could use even the center as a mini study, you know, if you brought people around the table here to get a sense of how many, you know, lived cultures we have and how we negotiate this.